A man walks into his office before sunrise. Everything is silent, his desk spotless, his calendar full, his jaw tight. He checks his phone, his team's messages, his reflection in the glass. Every box is ticked. Every person obeys. And yet, he can't breathe. Because what he's really afraid of isn't losing control. It's what might happen if he ever stopped trying to control everything. Here's the thing, weak men don't crave power because they love control. They crave it because without control, they'd have to face who they really are. And that's where every downfall begins, not outside, but inside. So ask yourself, are you actually in control? Or just terrified of losing it? Here's the thing about control. It feels powerful only when you don't have any. History is full of men who tried to rule the world because they couldn't rule themselves. The most obvious one? Hitler. A man who looked like he controlled millions, yet couldn't even control the noise in his own head. His empire was built on fear, not strength. That is what most people don't understand. Control driven by fear isn't power, it's panic in disguise. He wanted the world to bend to his will because he couldn't bear the thought of being small. He micromanaged everything, his generals, his people, his own image, because the idea of uncertainty terrified him. And that's what weak men do. They chase control not because they want order, but because they can't live with chaos. Chaos exposes who they really are, uncentered, insecure, reactive. You don't have to be a dictator to fall into that trap. Look around the manager who needs to know every detail, the boyfriend who checks his partner's phone, the influencer who deletes comments that challenge him. It's all the same pattern. Fear wearing the mask of control. When a man feels powerless inside, he starts policing the world outside. He'll tell himself it's leadership, but deep down, it's anxiety management. He can't sit still. He can't trust. He can't delegate. Because the moment he lets go, he has to face himself. And that's the one person he's never learned to manage. Control, at its core, is an addiction. It gives a temporary high the illusion of stability, the comfort of knowing everything is in place. But like any addiction, it grows. The more you control, the more you need to control. Until you're left alone, surrounded by order but starving for peace. I once knew a man who ran a small company. He tracked every email, every phone call, every lunch break. He said he wanted efficiency. What he really wanted was reassurance. He didn't trust anyone, not because they were untrustworthy, but because he never trusted himself to handle disappointment. He built systems around him to protect his ego from being hurt. And that's what weak men do. They build cages and call them kingdoms. Here's what's funny. The more control they seek, the weaker they become. Because control depends on the outside world staying predictable. And the world is anything but predictable. So the moment something breaks the pattern, a rejection, a crisis, a betrayal, they crumble. Their self-worth collapses because it was built on a structure they could never fully hold. That's why strong men don't chase control. They embody it. They lead without needing to dominate. They influence without micromanaging. Because their control comes from within, from the discipline of mastering their impulses, not other people. But we'll get to that later. For now, understand this. Every man who obsesses over control is hiding from one thing, the fear of his own weakness. He's afraid to be exposed. Afraid that if he stops holding everything together, everyone will see the cracks. The irony? The cracks are what make a man real. They let humility in. They remind you that power is not about never breaking, it's about rebuilding without fear. So if you ever find yourself trying to control everything, stop and ask, what am I afraid of losing? Because 9 times out of 10, the answer isn't power. It's dignity, it's certainty, it's self-worth. And until a man learns to build those from within, he'll always confuse control for strength. Here's what most people miss about control. It doesn't begin with power, it begins with fear. That silent, private kind of fear that whispers, if I don't hold it all together, everything will fall apart. And once that thought roots itself in your mind, you start building your life around it. You start managing everything, people, image, outcomes, until control becomes your comfort blanket. Elizabeth Holmes is the perfect example. Not the villain from documentaries, but the pattern she represents. the desperate chase for control disguised as ambition. She built an empire around an idea that barely existed. But here's the real psychology beneath it. She didn't crave innovation. She craved certainty. She wanted to prove she was exceptional, untouchable, someone who could never be doubted. So she created a world where doubt wasn't allowed to exist. Every time the truth threatened that illusion, she tightened her grip, firing anyone who questioned her, silencing voices that broke the fantasy. She wasn't controlling others because she was strong. She was controlling them because she was terrified. Terrified of being ordinary. Terrified of losing the illusion that made her feel safe. That's what fear does to people. It doesn't always make you run. Sometimes it makes you build a fortress around your insecurities and call it success. You think you're protecting your vision, but you're really protecting your ego. I see that same psychology in modern men. The guy who has to win every argument, the one who tracks his girlfriend's location, or the one who can't take feedback without feeling attacked. They all share one belief. If I'm not in control, I'll disappear. But here's the paradox. The tighter they hold on, the faster everything slips away. Because control built on fear doesn't create stability, it breeds fragility. It's like clenching your fist to hold water. The harder you squeeze, the more you lose. Fear-driven control shows up in subtle ways too. Like when a man can't rest because he's terrified of being outworked. Or when he checks his phone every 10 minutes because he's afraid of missing something important. It's the same psychology Holmes had control as a defense mechanism against the unknown. What this really means is that most men aren't addicted to control. They're addicted to safety. They want to know everything, plan everything, predict everything because they never learned how to trust themselves in uncertainty. And when you don't trust yourself, you start trying to control everything around you. But control is never enough. There's always another variable, another person, another outcome that refuses to bend. So you keep tightening your grip until all you're holding is stress. Here's the truth. Strong men aren't fearless. They've just made peace with fear. They know fear doesn't disappear. It just changes shape. And once you accept that, control becomes unnecessary. Holmes never learned that. Her empire wasn't built on innovation. It was built on panic. The panic of not being enough. When the cracks started showing, she doubled down on control instead of reflection. And that's how most weak men collapse, not from failure, but from the weight of pretending they were never afraid. You'll see it everywhere. In relationships, where one person controls because they're afraid to be abandoned. In workplaces where bosses micromanage because they're afraid to be irrelevant. In life where people live on edge because they're afraid the moment they stop fighting, they'll be forgotten. But what if control isn't strength? What if it's just fear wearing a confident face? Here's a thought. Real strength might be the opposite of control. It might be trust. The ability to trust that even if things fall apart, you won't. That's the kind of confidence that can't be faked. It's not about predicting outcomes. It's about knowing you can adapt to them. When you operate from fear, your life becomes a performance. When you operate from trust, your life becomes an experience. Fear builds walls. Trust builds awareness. And awareness is where real control begins, not the kind that manipulates, but the kind that manages your own reactions. So if you ever catch yourself tightening up, needing to prove, needing to know, needing to dominate, pause. Ask yourself, what am I afraid will happen if I don't control this? Usually the answer is simple. You're afraid of being seen as weak. But here's the twist. Owning that fear is what makes you strong. The moment you name it, it loses half its power. You stop reacting and start observing. You realize that the need to control others is just a mirror reflecting your lack of control within. Elizabeth Holmes couldn't face that mirror. She built a kingdom of glass and pretended it was steel. And when truth finally walked in, she didn't break the illusion broke her. Fear of losing control is the fastest way to lose it, because control based on fear always ends in collapse. The only control that lasts is the one built from inside, the kind that doesn't panic when things go wrong, because it never depended on things going right. That's where we're headed next, the kind of control no one can take from you. The power that begins and ends with self-command. Here's the thing most men get wrong about control. It's not about domination, it's about direction. Not the ability to bend others to your will, but the ability to stay steady when life bends you. That's what Epictetus understood better than almost anyone. He was born a slave. He had no say in where he lived, what he ate, or when he slept. His body was owned, but his mind was not. And that single decision to master what he could control made him freer than most men with crowns. He learned early that there are two worlds, the outer one, where events happen, and the inner one, where meaning is created. The weak man spends his whole life fighting the outer world, people, luck, circumstances. The strong man wins the inner one. That's the war Epictetus fought, and it's the same war every man fights today. We think freedom means doing whatever we want. But look around how many free men are still chained to anger, jealousy, or the need to be seen. They're not free. They're slaves to reaction. Epictetus would have smiled at them and said, "You're still owned just by your emotions." Here's what self-command really means. When someone disrespects you, you don't rush to defend your ego. When a plan fails, you don't spiral into panic. You pause. You observe. You respond from strength, not from fear. That pause, that half second between impulse and action, is where your real power lives. Most men never find it. They confuse movement with mastery. They think if they yell louder, push harder, or plan more, they'll feel in control. But that's noise, not power. Self-command is quiet, it's patient, it's ruthless in its awareness. I once watched a fighter in a training gym who reminded me of Epictetus. He wasn't the biggest or fastest, but when he got punched, he never flinched. He didn't take the hit personally, he just adjusted. Every round, he got calmer. Every blow made him sharper. When the bell rang, he bowed not to his opponent, but to his own discipline. That's what it looks like when a man owns himself. Because control of others is temporary, control of self is eternal. You can take away a man's money, title, or comfort, but you can't take away his discipline once he's built it. And discipline isn't punishment. It's protection. It shields you from the chaos of your own mind. Epictetus used to tell his students, "You may not choose what happens, but you can choose how it defines you." Think about that. Most people live the other way around. They let circumstances dictate their character. Lose a job, they lose faith. Get insulted, they lose composure. They think they're reacting to life, but really, they're surrendering to it. Here's the difference between a weak man and a powerful one. A weak man reacts to emotion. A powerful man responds to principle. Principle is the anchor that keeps you from drifting in emotional storms. That's why self-command doesn't make you cold, it makes you clear. It doesn't numb emotion, it gives it direction. Anger becomes fuel instead of fire. Fear becomes focus instead of paralysis. Desire becomes discipline instead of distraction. But let's be honest, mastering yourself is harder than mastering others. It's easier to control people than it is to control your own thoughts. That's why most men never even try. They'd rather lead armies than sit quietly with themselves for 10 minutes. Because silence reveals the truth, and the truth demands accountability. Here's the thing. Self-command doesn't make life easier. It makes you stronger than difficulty. You stop negotiating with weakness. You stop chasing validation. You stop blaming the world for what's missing inside you. And people notice. They start to trust you, not because you're loud, but because you're stable. They can sense when a man isn't ruled by impulse. That kind of steadiness can't be faked, it's felt. Epictetus didn't have wealth or status, yet even Roman nobles sought his counsel. Why? Because he had what they couldn't buy, sovereignty of mind. He'd mastered the smallest kingdom that exists, the space between thought and action. That's what separates strong men from controlling men. The strong man controls himself so deeply that others feel calm around him. The weak man tries to control others so desperately that everyone feels tense near him. One radiates order, the other radiates fear. You can feel the difference instantly at work, in relationships, in any room you walk into. A self-commanded man doesn't need to prove he's in charge. He simply is in charge of himself. And that's why external control will always be an illusion. The moment you rely on it, you've already lost it. But internal control, that's the kind that compounds. The more you use it, the stronger it gets. Here's the takeaway. Don't chase control. Build command. Start with the basics. Your breath, your reactions, your routine. If you can govern those, the rest of the world becomes negotiable. That's the power Epictetus carried without ever holding a sword. And that's the same power you can carry today. Quiet, steady, unbreakable. Because when a man commands himself, life stops feeling like chaos. It starts feeling like clarity. Here's where everything comes together. We've talked about the illusion of control, the fear that fuels it, and the kind of self-command that replaces it. Now let us talk about the final stage, the way strong men move through the world without needing to grip it. Bruce Lee understood that better than almost anyone. He called it being like water. Everyone quotes that line, but few understand what it actually means. Water doesn't control, yet it conquers. It adapts. It flows around obstacles, and given time, it carves through stone. That's what real strength looks like. Quiet, patient, unstoppable. Lee's life wasn't about domination, it was about integration. He didn't want to win over others, he wanted to master expression. He studied philosophy, boxing, fencing, Taoism not to collect ideas, but to dissolve limitation. And that's what a powerful man does. He stops identifying with form and starts identifying with flow. He trained until every movement was instinct, not decision. He trusted himself so completely that control became unnecessary. That's what mastery looks like. It's not the death of fear, it's the death of hesitation. Most men are stuck because they still fight the world. They think life is something to dominate. They chase titles, possessions, people, anything that proves they're in charge. But control is heavy. It slows you down. It makes you rigid, and rigidity always breaks. The strong man doesn't chase control. He builds rhythm. He learns when to push and when to let go. He knows that strength without sensitivity becomes destruction. And sensitivity without strength becomes chaos. Balance is what makes him dangerous. Bruce Lee once said, "Under duress, we do not rise to our expectations. We fall to our level of training." That's what self-command prepares you for the fall. Because when pressure hits, you don't get to fake strength. You reveal whatever you've built in silence. If you've trained your emotions, you stay calm. If you've trained your discipline, you stay sharp. If you've trained your awareness, you see what others miss. That's why strong men seem almost peaceful. They don't need to prove anything, they're too busy observing. They read energy before words. They sense intent before action. Because their awareness is wide open, not suffocated by the need to control every detail. Think of the last time you met someone who radiated calm under pressure. They didn't raise their voice. They didn't explain their authority. They just were. That's power. The kind that makes people listen without being told to. The weak man thinks control gives him identity. The strong man knows identity is just a mask. He can play roles leader, friend, lover, warrior, but he's not trapped by any of them. He flows between them like water between rocks, unattached but fully present. That's what Bruce meant when he said, "Be water." It wasn't just about martial arts, it was about masculinity itself. Masculinity isn't about holding the line, it's about holding your center. You bend without breaking. You adapt without losing direction. And that's what makes you impossible to manipulate. When you master yourself, control becomes obsolete. Because you no longer fear loss. You can let things go without collapsing. You can walk away from arguments, deals, even relationships not from weakness, but from awareness. You know your peace costs more than their approval. That's when you start to feel truly powerful. Not the loud, visible kind of power. The grounded kind, the kind people feel when you walk into a room and everything steadies. It's the energy of a man who no longer fights himself. Control makes you reactive. Command makes you responsive. Mastery makes you effortless. That's the journey. Weak men chase control to hide their chaos. Strong men build control to stabilize it. Masters let go of control because they've outgrown the need for it. And that's the paradox. When you stop trying to control everything, you finally have influence over it, because energy moves toward calm, not tension. People follow presence, not pressure. So here's what this all comes down to. Control is about fear. Command is about discipline. Mastery is about freedom. You can live your whole life building walls to protect your ego, or you can build awareness that protects your peace. One keeps you anxious, the other keeps you alive. The strong man doesn't conquer the world. He aligns with it. He lets life move, and he moves with it not as a victim, not as a controller, but as a participant who understands his role. Bruce Lee once said, "The successful warrior is the average man, with laser-like focus. That's it. You don't need to be extraordinary. You need to be intentional, because focus is what turns chaos into flow." So as you finish this, remember, power isn't about being untouchable. It's about being unshakable. When you stop chasing control and start mastering response, you stop living like a pawn and start thinking like a king. The weak need power to feel alive. The strong create power by being alive. And that's the difference between men who rule through fear and men who lead through presence. When was the last time you mistook control for strength? Think about it. The answer might tell you exactly where your real power begins. Subscribe for more. We're just getting started. This is Phantom Thoughts. He walks out of the same office now, lights off, phone silent. Nothing to control. No one to command. And for the first time, he isn't anxious. He's awake. Because control was never the goal, peace was. And peace doesn't come from holding tighter. It comes from finally letting go of everything that was holding you. Here's what most men never realize. When you stop chasing control, you start attracting respect. When you stop proving power, you start becoming it. So the question isn't whether you have control, it's whether control still has you. If that hits something inside, you subscribe. Because this isn't just motivation. This is Phantom Thoughts, where men wake up to who they really are.